Well, Noam, what shall we talk about?
Well, we can talk about the neoliberal assault on the world's population in the last generation, which you've written so brilliantly about.
What strikes me, given the last quite eventful year of my life, what really strikes me is the major disconnect between the philosophy and ideology of neoliberalism and that which I encountered when negotiating, in inverted commas negotiating, when being dictated by the great and the good of the neoliberal international financial establishment. Now, think about it. If you take the great libertarians, the great neoliberals, who castigate all tax-funded activities, and you consider the reason why I'm here today and I'm not still the Minister of Finance of Greece. Why? It's because I refuse another 100 billion smackers, dollars, of a tax-backed loan to my insolvent government, which the creditors insisted that I should take.
The three nines.
It's astonishing. So here it is. So here you have the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission insisting that our bankrupt state takes on another 100 billion under conditions that guarantee that we will not be able to repay the taxpayers of Europe that will be granting us that money. And that comes from neoliberals, who supposedly are against all tax-funded loans to government, and who supposedly believe that an insolvent entity doesn't have the moral right to take on more loans.
But as you point out, what is it, 90% of those loans go to French and German bankers.
That was the first loan. This loan, it would go from the one pocket of the creditors to another pocket of the creditors, so that they would maintain the pretense that Greece was not bankrupt. But effectively, what I'm trying to say is the intense hypocrisy of the neoliberal establishment, which is not really even interested in sticking to its own neoliberal ideology. This is just 19th century power politics of crushing anyone who dares stand up to them and say a simple word, no.
But I think that's actually traditional. One of the paradoxes of neoliberalism is that it's not new and it's not liberal.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
If you look at what you describe is a form of hypocrisy, but the same is true of saying that we should not support tax-funded institutions. The financial sector is basically tax-funded.
Of course.
You recall the IMF study of the leading American banks, which determined that virtually all their profits come from their implicit government insurance policy, cheap credit, access to higher credit ratings, incentives to take risky transactions which are profitable, but then if it's problematic, you guys pay for it. Or just take the basis of the contemporary economy, which actually I've been privileged to see developing in government subsidized laboratories for decades. MIT, where I've been since the 1950s, is one of the institutions where the government, the funnel in the early days was the Pentagon, was pouring in money to create the basis for the high-tech economy of the future and the profit-making of the institutions that are regarded as private enterprises. It was decades of work under public funding with a very anti-capitalist ideology. So according to capitalist principles, if someone invests in a risky enterprise over a long period and 30 years later it makes some profit, they're supposed to get part of the profit. But it doesn't work like that here. It was the taxpayer who invested for decades. The profit goes to Apple and Microsoft. not to the taxpayer.
Indeed. If you take an iPhone apart, every single technology in it was developed by some government grant.
And for
every single one.
And for long
and some
period.
of them by government grants from other countries,
Yeah.
like Wi-Fi from the Australian
And
Commonwealth.
you see an interesting picture of it from a place like MIT or other major research institutions. So if you walked around the building where I work 50 years ago, you would have seen electronic firms, Raytheon, iTech, others, IBM, there to essentially rob the technology that's being developed at public expense and seeing if they can turn it into something applicable for profits. You walk around the institution today, you see different buildings. You see Novartis, Pfizer, big pharmaceutical corporations. Why? Because the cutting edge of the economy has shifted from electronics-based to biology-based. So therefore, the predators in the so-called private sector are there to see what they can pick up from the taxpayer-funded research in fundamental biological sciences. And that's called free enterprise and a free market system. So speak of hypocrisy, it's pretty hard to go beyond that.
Quite right. This hypocrisy is fundamental to the whole enterprise culture of capitalism from
the
250 years ago. I mean, the whole notion that there can be a market system which is at an arm's length separated from a state which is the enemy is the sickest joke in the history of humankind. If you think that, I mean, this narrative of private wealth creation, which is appropriated by the big bad wolf, the state, on behalf of trades unions and the working class that need a social welfare net, is just a preposterous reversal of the truth. That wealth is being created collectively and appropriated privately. But right from the beginning, I mean, the enclosures in Britain would never have happened without the king's army.
That's
and without state brutality for pushing peasants off their ancestors' land and creating the commodification of labor, the commodification of land, which then gave rise to capitalism. Just half an hour ago, we were being shown, some of us, the magnificent collection of maps of the city of New York in this wonderful building. And you could see in one of the maps of Alabama the precise depiction of the theft of land from Native Americans, the way in which it was parceled up, commodified. Now, that would never have happened without the brutal intervention of the state, which created the process of privatization of land and therefore of commodification.
Actually, one of my favorite passages from Adam Smith is where he gives advice to the new colonies, to newly liberated colonies, as to how they should pursue sound economics, which is pretty much what the IMF tells the third world today. What he said is the advice was you should concentrate on what was later called comparative advantage, produce agricultural products, you're good at that, export furs, fish, and so on. But don't try to produce manufacturing goods, because Britain, England, has superior manufacturing goods. So therefore you should import them from England. They're good at that, you're good at cotton and corn. Incidentally, the cotton was hardly by free enterprise. And you should certainly not try to monopolize the resources that you have. And if you pursue those practices, then everybody will be better off. Economic theory proves that. Well, the United States happened to be free of English control. So therefore they were able to do the opposite, just as England had done. high tariffs to block British goods, enabled them to create a textile industry, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, later in the century a steel industry, blocking superior British steel, and right up to the present, as I've mentioned, with high tech. As far as monopolization is concerned, the US made a major effort to monopolize the basic resource for the early Industrial Revolution, namely cotton. That's the oil of the 19th century. And the US had most of it, not all of it. And the conquest of Mexico, which was not exactly by free enterprise, was largely undertaken to try to gain a monopoly of cotton, which would overcome the major enemy in those days, which was Britain. Britain was the big force, the enemy. And the Jacksonian presidents, Tyler, Peirce, mid-19th century, their position was that if we could monopolize cotton, we could bring England to our feet. That way we could really defeat them. They didn't quite make it, but made a lot. Incidentally, that effort was what Saddam Hussein was charged with in 1990. The charge was ludicrous, but the charge was he was going to try to monopolize oil and bring us all to his feet, which was crazy. But the US did try to monopolize cotton, and that's part of the way in which power shifted from England to the United States. And I think that's a pretty good record of the way sound economics has worked over the years. There have been places where sound economics was applied, liberal policies. It's called the Third World. And it's not an accident. You take a look at the global South. One country developed, Japan, the one country that was not colonized. Take a look at East Asia, the tigers of East Asia. One exception, the one that was conquered by the United States, 1898, with a couple 100,000 people killed and stays semi-colonized, not part of the Asian tiger explosion of industrialization. The pattern is just uniform, but somehow hasn't entered economic theory. Wonder why. You're an economist.
Well, the reason why it never entered economic theory was because economics in universities began to evolve from the 1950s onwards as the queen of the social sciences. And what gave discursive power and monopoly power within the academic environment to economics was the claim that it was the only social theory which was peddling universal truths to be proven by mathematical means. And it succeeded. So when a sociologist, an anthropologist, and an economist applied for a grant, it was always the economist who got it on the basis of this discursive monopoly. And however, in order to close the model mathematically, the only way to solve the equations is by making assumptions that distance the model from really existing capitalism. So, for instance, you have to assume that there's no time and there's no space. Because if you allow time to interfere with your model or space to enter, you end up with indeterminacy. In other words, you end up with a system of equations that cannot be solved or that have an infinity of possible solutions, and then you have no predictive power. Yeah. You can't say, well, this is what's going to happen. So we have a very interesting inverse Darwinian process. The more successful economists were at creating models that said precisely nothing about capitalism, the greater their success in the academy. So they became the opposite of the public intellectuals that you've been writing about. They create wonderful abstractions, aesthetically pleasing models that I spent quite a few years studying, in the same way that you go to a museum and you look at a piece of abstract art, but you don't expect to find the truth of capitalism in its form. So this is the interesting sociology of knowledge within the economics profession. But then there is a parallel shift, the end of Bretton Woods, which unleashed banking. Remember, Roosevelt made sure that in the Bretton Woods Conference, which designed the post-war, the first post-war phase between the 1940s and 1971, 1973, he had stipulated that one kind of person should not be allowed into the Bretton Woods Conference. You know who these people were? Bankers. Not one banker attended the Bretton Woods Conference, and that was at the explicit order of FDR. And so you had boring banks between 1944 and 1971. But after 1971, and we can discuss why that is, suddenly banking was unleashed, and their capacity effectively to mint private money became unlimited and essential to the second post-war phase of global capitalism, of American hegemony. During this unleashing, there was a need for a theoretical and ideological cover. So I don't blame my fellow economists for pulling the trigger that created so much devastation in 2008 and before that and after that, but I blame them for providing the mathematical models, the sermons, which steadied the hand of the financiers and allowed them to believe that what they were doing was perfectly okay, consistent with science, provable mathematically that it was riskless, and therefore allowed them the mental and emotional strength to do a lot more damage than they would have done otherwise.
Actually, one of the more interesting moments in the history of science and scholarship was actually in 2008. As you know, for decades, economists had been claiming with extreme arrogance that they completely understood how to control and manage an economy. There were fundamental principles like the efficient market hypothesis, rational expectations, and anyone who didn't accept this was dismissed as a kind of some strange kind of moron. The whole system collapsed. The whole intellectual edifice collapsed in a most amazing fashion and had no effect on the profession.
None at all. Well, it did have. It had the effect that sometimes, you know, when we're driving on a freeway, and I usually go well above the speed limit, condemned if you will, and I get stopped by the police, for the next 20 minutes I drive below the speed limit, but it doesn't last for more than 20 minutes. Then after a while I just go back to where I was. This is exactly like the economics profession. They had a brief moment of...
some did, but...
Some. Or at least of being a bit humble and staying, you know, keeping their heads under the parapet for a bit. But then within 20 minutes they forgot about it and they carried on teaching the same rubbish to their students. But what is interesting, Noam, is that two small points. It's not that the economists went headlong into this mathematized religion, because that's what it is. It's a religion with equations and with a bit of bad statistics. What happened was two things. Firstly, there was a kind of ethnic cleansing of anybody that had retained their wits about the economy. So there were economists who challenged this view and who were simply not reproduced by the system. They never got the grants, they never got the PhD students, their PhD students never got lectureships, never got assistant professorships. So there was a purge of the establishment. The second, which is a far more interesting phenomenon, is that the wonderful minds that created the general equilibrium models, the highest, the popes of the Catholic Church, were not believers. So take, for instance, Kenaro. Kenaro is, you know, and Gerard Debreu. They're the ones that John Nash, they established the mathematical theorems upon which all this hypocrisy is based. Now, these people, Kenaro, I remember in the early 1990s, he was giving a talk at NYU, and there were about 20 people. It was a highly mathematized paper. Okay, so he was enthusiastically going through the equations, and one of the professors there interrupted him at some point and said, Professor Arrow, equation 3.3 reminds me of the argument in favor of this kind of tax as opposed to that kind of tax. And Ken stopped him immediately and said, my dear boy, he was a bit condescending, I think rightly so, he said, you're confusing that which is interesting with that which is useful. This is interesting. If you try to apply to anything real, it's dangerous. So the gurus, the popes, understood that this theory was examining a post-capitalist world, a world without labor markets, without labor exploitation, without monopolies, without even the slightest of capacities to alter prices on the behalf of employers, of entrepreneurs, of conglomerates, a world without firms. Because what is a company? A company is a market-free zone. It's a hierarchy. It's a small Soviet Union with Gosplan and central planning. If you look at Google, if you look at Microsoft, that's what it is.
Then you have Coase's theorem. That's a big help.
Yes, yes. But the Coase's theorem is taught for 5 seconds and then forgotten.
Yeah.
In order to make them feel that they've said something about the reason why firms exist. Yeah. But then in those models that produce the macroeconomic policies that were applied even under Clinton, especially under Clinton, there are no firms. There's no time, no firms, no space. Everybody resides on the same point in space so that there are no costs of transport or anything like that. So imagine a world in which economic policy is predicated upon models that assume there is no time, space, firms, profit, or economic rent.
Or monopolies.
It's time to get really scared.